Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this author interaction organized as a part of the NLF Reading Challenge 2021. My name is Kartika. I'm the head of reading at Neev Academy. We're very excited to be here, and we hope you are too. The NLF Reading Challenge is a 6-month-long reading event from January to June 2021 for students between 10 to 13 years of age. It is open to participants on the competitive or the non-competitive tracks. We have students from across India participating in the challenge. In addition, include with a quiz competition that will see the 3 best teams win gold, silver, and bronze engraved trophies respectively, certificates of achievement, and a great set of books. Before we dive into the interaction, we would just like to point out to our audience that as this is a webinar, we will not be able to respond if you raise your virtual hand. Instead, you could type your questions on the Q&A box. In fact, if you already have your questions ready, please feel free to type them out. If you are a student, a teacher, or a school librarian, please do mention the name of your school along with your question as well. Today we have with us a very special guest, the award-winning author John Connolly. He is the winner of a number of literary prizes for his work, including the Edgar, Seamus, and Anthony Awards, and a CWA Dagger. His latest books are The Dirty South, A Book of Bones, and He. Welcome, John. We're very happy to have you with us today.
Hello, how are you? Can you hear me? Sorry, that was technology getting in my way. How are you?
We're very well. It's so nice to have you here with us today.
I'm very pleased. Our thoughts are with you all. I know you're having a very difficult time at the moment. Lost his mother. He had in truth been losing her for a very long time. The disease that was killing her was a creeping, cowardly thing, a sickness eating away at her from the inside, slowly consuming the light within so that her eyes grew a little less bright with each passing day and her skin a little more pale. And as she was stolen away from him, piece by piece, the boy became more and more afraid of finally losing her entirely. He wanted her to stay. He had no brothers and no sisters, and while he loved his father, it would be true to say that he loved his mother more. He could not bear to think of a life without her. The boy, whose name was David, did everything that he could, kept in part that his mother the light within so that her eyes grew a little less bright with each passing day and her skin a little more pale. And as she was stolen away from him, piece by piece, the boy became more and more afraid of finally losing her entirely. He wanted her to stay. He had no brothers and no sisters, and while he loved his father, it would be true to say that he loved his mother more. He could not bear to think of a life without her. The boy, whose name was David, did everything that he could to keep his mother alive. He prayed. He tried to be good so that she would not be punished for his mistakes. He padded around the house as quietly as he was able and kept his voice down when he was playing war games with his toy soldiers. He created a routine, and he tried to keep to that routine as closely as possible because he believed in part that his mother's fate was linked to the actions he performed. He would always get out of bed by putting his left foot on the floor first, then his right. He always counted up to 20 when he was brushing his teeth, and he always stopped when the count was completed. He always touched the taps in the bathroom and the handles of the doors a certain number of times. Odd numbers were bad, but even numbers were fine, with 2, 4, and 8 being particularly favourable, although he didn't care for 6 because 6 was twice the second part of 13, and 13 was very bad indeed. If he bumped his head against something, he would bump it a second time to keep the numbers even, and sometimes he would have to do it again and again because his head seemed to bounce against the wall, ruining his count, or his hair glanced against it when he didn't want it to, until his skull ached from the effort and he felt giddy and sick. For an entire year during the worst of his mother's illness, he carried the same items from his bedroom to the kitchen first thing in the morning and then back again last thing at night. A small copy of Grimm's Selected Fairy Tales and a dog-eared magnet comic, the book to be placed perfectly in the center of the comic, and both to be laid with their edges lined up against the corner of the rug on his bedroom floor at night or on the seat of his favorite kitchen chair in the morning. In these ways, David made his contribution to his mother's survival.
Thank you for that, John. Now, with such a compelling beginning, we have to ask. We know that you're really fond of fairy tales, that it's always fascinated you. You've also talked about the fact that David, as a protagonist, was someone who's very similar to who you were as a child. Can you talk us through a little bit about how the idea for the book came to you, and how did
Sure,
the plot develop for you?
sure. Well, the idea, as you say, I was very similar to David. I had, as a kid, and I think a lot of young people have it, particularly in adolescence, I had a form of OCD where, and I think it's quite natural in some ways. I know kids worry about it a great deal when it happens, and you can think you're going mad. But when you're young, you feel you have no control over the world. You know, the adult world seems like it has no time for you. You're very vulnerable. You have your power is very, very limited. And so when I was young, I had little routines that I thought could affect the world. You know, I thought if I did things, everything would be okay. And it was my way of assuming some kind of control and power. And of course, it doesn't work. You know, the universe doesn't work that way. And yet, for a time, it seemed like it might for me. And a bit like David, I worried. I went through a phase of worrying about my parents. What would happen if my parents died? What would happen if they left me? And that came from a very odd moment when I was a child. I wasn't a very bright child, I have to say. Um, and I was from a generation that pretty much, as soon as you could leave the house safely by yourself, you were sent off to school with a big bag on your back. And so at the age of 5 or 6, I was walking to school by myself and walking home. And I came home one day and our house was gone. And we lived in a terraced house. It's very hard to move a terraced house. You can move a bungalow or a caravan. You can't move a house that's part of another series of houses without leaving a gap. But I came home, I could not find my house. My house was gone. And I remember very clearly sitting down on the pavement used to be and crying, thinking, I've been abandoned. How much did my parents hate me that they waited until I went to school before moving everybody? And we lived with my grandmother, and she didn't like leaving the house at all. So they had to move the grandmother, the dog, all the furniture, and the house itself. And my next door neighbor, who was a lovely lady called Mrs. Curran, came out and she said, why are you sitting on the pavement crying? And I said, well, in case you haven't noticed, more or less, you know, my house is gone and can I come and live with you? And she said, no, they haven't moved your house, dear. They just painted the outside of it while you were at school. Because I didn't know the number of my house. All I knew was that I lived in a house with green, you know, gables on it. And while I was in school, without anybody telling me, they'd repainted the front of the house. And that always stuck with me, that idea that, you know, maybe your parents might leave you. And it's very much something that happens in fairy tales. If you, the story of Hansel and Gretel, for example, where, you know, the mother and father, they don't have the money to feed the children anymore, and they abandon them in the forest and leave them to fend for themselves. I felt like a character in a fairy tale, and that had always stuck with me. And I suppose at some point I decided that I wanted to write a book about grief and loss and how we get through it, how these bad things that happen in our lives sometimes, they don't have to define us. And you can come out of it. We're all going to go through these things. We're all going to go through stuff that we really don't want to go through. And we were talking about it earlier. There are people in India at the moment going through the most terrible times. And sometimes it seems like they will never end. And people who are going to lose parents, they're going to lose people who matter to them. And the strange thing about life and the terrible thing about life is that we will all go through that. By the nature of things, we lose our mums and dads. As we get older, they get old, and we continue on and we have their memories. And nobody is ever going to go through that the way that you do. Nobody is ever going to fall in love the way that you fall in love. No one is ever going to suffer a broken heart the way you suffer a broken heart. It's entirely unique to you. And yet there are things that everybody goes through. And one of the lovely things about books, and one of the most important things about books and stories, is that I think if they're done properly, they make you feel a little bit less alone. Because what books and stories do, and what I was trying to do in the Book of Lost Things, was to explore something that we all go through and to try and give you some consolation about it. And I have over the years done events in schools and done events with children. And almost every time somebody will come up at the end and say, you know, when I was little, I lost my mom, or when I was little, I lost my dad. And I thought that nobody understood what I was going through, because it's a very difficult thing to go through. And so when you read a book that touches on your own experience and makes you feel understood, it's a little bit like the author reaching out from the page and touching your hand very gently and saying, I know. The easiest thing in the world for people to say is, I'm sorry for you. If something bad has happened, we say, I'm really sorry about that. And you do mean it. You mean that you're genuinely sorry. But what most of us want for somebody to say is, I understand. I understand what you're going through. And I can appreciate it. And here is what I think about this. And here, I hope you find this helpful. And I suppose that was what I was trying to do in the Book of Lost Things. I was trying to write a book that in some way provided consolation and help when you're going through those difficult times.
Actually, I think your answer has just spoken to a question and a remark that one of our viewers has just put in. Mona Singh from Seth MR Jaipuria School, who says that I really appreciate the protagonist David for fighting against the negative feelings he harbored inside him and standing out as the winner. Was there an age group that you had in mind when you wrote, or that you would recommend this book to? I know you've described the Book of Lost Things as a children's book for adults, and that your readers have taken new things away from it every time they've come to it.
Yeah, sure. What a lovely observation, Mona. I didn't, I don't think that necessarily when you become an adolescent, we're always, as we're young, we're always trying to strain slightly older. If you're 10 years old, you don't want to read books for 9-year-olds. You want to read bbooks for 12-year-olds and 14-year-olds. And I think by the time you're a teenager, particularly, you're essentially trying to come to terms with the adult world. You really, really are. And so the Book of Lost Things was written so that both adults and younger people could read it, but would read it in slightly different ways, I think. An adult reading it will maybe have gone through an awful lot of the things that I mentioned in the book, and will be looking back on them in a way. Whereas a younger person reading it is probably going through all those things at the time. It's much more immediate for you. You are struggling with the world. You are young. You are wondering, how am I going to fit into it? What is my life going to be like when I leave school? How am I going to, being an adult seems really difficult. How do you pay bills? How does that work? All of these things. But also, like I said, those more difficult things that may come into your life. And so it was written with that in mind, that it could be read in two completely different ways. And actually, to be honest, I hadn't realized just how immediate it would be for younger readers, I suppose, because when you're an adult, in some ways, you are writing as an adult. You can think yourself back to how you were as a young person, but you are trying to recall something from quite a long time before. But it always surprised me when particularly teenagers came up, and I realized, yes, of course, you're going through it. This is what you're going through every single day. My dad died when I was in my early 20s. My younger brother was in his teens, and I think it probably was much harder for him. I think I was moving into adulthood, whereas he was still mired in his teens a little bit. And I think when you lose a parent in childhood or your teenage years, it is much, much more difficult. You end up with a lot of stuff missing from your life. I think you feel that there are questions you didn't get to ask and things you didn't get to see. And I suppose that element feeds into the Book of Lost Things, the realization that, yes, when you're young, when you're a teenager, and I suppose I was drawing on something of my brother's recollections, that it is much more difficult. It is much more immediate. It is painful in a very, very different way from the loss of a parent when you're an adult.
Fair enough.
But I think I'm making it sound incredibly depressing. And the fact that was the thing I didn't want the book to be. It felt odd reading that opening section, and yet I think it was a good way to give you a sense of what David is going through. But in fact, what happens to David in the book is that he is drawn into a world that is not his own. He is drawn into a world, and I think it's a real world. People ask me, one of the questions I get asked quite often, is the world he enters real? Or is it just all in his imagination? And I think the book opens with a quotation from the painter Pablo Picasso, and he said, everything you can imagine is real. You can imagine it, it's real to you. And I think this world, it's, without getting too highfalutin about it, it's a subjective world. In other words, if you went into this world, it would be very different. And it's based on books and stories. If you and I read the same book, we may have completely different views on the book. it may come to us in completely different ways. Your life experience is different from mine. The things that interest you, the things that frighten you may be very, very different. So we can read the same book and we will have completely different responses to it. And it's why sometimes someone will give you a book and say, this is the best book I've ever read. It will change your life. And apart from you legitimately thinking, what's wrong with my life that you feel it has to change? The other thing you'll think is you'll pick it up and go, well, that doesn't really do it for me. And there's nothing wrong with you and there's nothing wrong with the other person. It's just that something in this book resonated with them in a different way. And I think that's what happens to David. David brings into this world all his feelings, all his pain, all his anger, but also a lot of the stories he's read. And the world is ready to change for him. So he comes in and he changes the world by being there. So if another child had gone through, maybe the child wouldn't have met the woodsman, because the first person David meets is a woodsman who protects him from wolves. You know, maybe he wouldn't meet the wolves. Maybe he wouldn't meet trolls. These are all products of because fairy tales. The world that he goes into is ready to give him a fairy tale world, because this is the way this is the way he's going to learn to live. This is the way he's going to come to terms with all of his pain, through stories and through the stories that matter to him.
So taking off on that, John, I know that we also have a reader who says that she's taken away a message of hope from it. She says that Kushali Singh says David's character is positive and appealing. But since you just taking off on what you've said about stories, the characters that you've chosen and the story tales that you've worked with in the book, the Crooked Man seems to be inspired by Rumpelstiltskin. The Woodsman is a savior. There are the Loops who come in. Are these motives that you have personally thought of before? Did they come to you while you were writing the story? We know that the Grimm stories were different from Hans Christian Andersen's versions. Are there Irish versions of fairy tales also? Did all of that come together for you? How did it come together for you?
It was a very odd experience writing the book. I generally don't plot books. I don't plan them out. That's not how I am as a person. I can't play chess, for example. I'm not able to play chess. I can't think that far ahead. You know, I can barely find my shoes in the morning. It's not the kind of person I am. And all I knew when I was sitting down was that vaguely I wanted to write about childhood and loss. And I wanted to write about fairy tales, because what had always interested me about fairy tales is that, as you point out, every culture has them. And every culture produces its own versions of the same stories. You know, like there's a Chinese version of Cinderella, but it seems to have developed almost independently of the Brothers Grimm, the story that the Brothers Grimm tell us, which itself is a much older folktale. And there's something very elemental about them. Sometimes we're told fairy tales are not trying to teach you how to be good. They have no interest in you being a good person, fairy tales. They want you to be clever. There are lessons in how to survive in the world. One of the things I was going to read, and maybe if you want me to read something very short, I will again, was at one point David is told a version of the story of Little Red Riding Hood. And Little Red Riding Hood is, you know, Little Red Riding Hood isn't just a story about wolves who dress up as grandmothers. You know, that's not the point of Little Red Riding Hood. Little Red Riding Hood is a kind of object lesson for teenage girls. And it says to them, actually, you need to be careful around men. Men are predatory. Men are wolves. And you need to watch how you deal with these people. And you need to be clever. You know, so there's stories that we're told as a way of educating people about the world. But not to be good, just to be smart. And when I began writing the book, at natural points as the story progressed, and I was discovering it as I wrote it, as somebody would tell David a story and it would change as I was writing it down, and I had not planned it. I had not sat down and thought, oh, the ending of Little Red Riding Hood is going to be different. The ending of Hansel and Gretel is going to be different. It was almost like I was getting in touch with something that's very deep in all our minds. We have passed these stories to generation. They're lodged in there, and they're lodged in there because they're important. And when you tap into them, you tap into something very old and very potent, I think. And when you're a writer, that's what you want to do sometimes. And you can't make that happen. You can't force that to happen. It happens very naturally, and it happens only occasionally. And it happened for me with the Book of Lost Things. So in an odd way, I have very little memory of actually sitting down and writing it. A lot of it just seemed to, and it's the only time that's ever really happened for me. I've always struggled to write other books. You know, I find writing quite difficult. You know, I do it and it's my job and I do it every day. But there are still days when I find it very, very hard. Writing the Book of Lost Things was not hard. It all came about really, really naturally and really, really strangely.
That's interesting. We have a lot of young writers in the audience. We have a question again from Kushali Singh, who asks you, do you have any tips on how somebody can go about, or suggestions on how somebody can go about writing a good fantasy story? You've talked about how you were in a flow with writing the Book of Lost Things. Is that something that you would recommend?
You know, I tried teaching once and I was really hopeless at it because everything I knew about writing, I could tell people in about 3 minutes. So you're getting my writing course now. You know, it doesn't matter whether you're writing fantasy stories, whether you're writing crime stories, whether you're writing science fiction or romance, it's all the same. Everything is about character and people. You start with people. People think you start with a plot. You don't start with a plot, you start with the person. Just like the Book of Lost Things starts with David. David, a boy struggling with grief. And out of that, a story will emerge. What I do know is that writing is a craft and it's a skill. And like any craft and skill, you have to do it quite regularly. You know, there's no point in saying during my summer holidays, I'm going to write my great Indian novel. It's probably not going to happen. You know, you're probably going to think it's a sunny day. What am I doing staring at the book for hours and hours and hours? So most writers learn to write a little bit every day. That's what and you write something small when, you know, maybe 100 words. Your 100 words you can probably do in 10 minutes. Do your 100 words a day. Put it away and don't feel guilty. Go off and do something else with your time. Read a book, watch TV, go out with your friends, whatever it might be. You've done what you set out to do. And the other thing is, if you write the first sentence of something, you have to commit to writing the last sentence too. Because what happens when you begin writing, whether it's a story, a poem, a song, whether you begin a painting sometimes, you begin it with all kinds of enthusiasm. You think, this is fantastic. I've got a great idea. This is going to be the best story ever. And you get into it, excuse me, a page or two, and you start thinking, well, maybe this isn't such a great story after all. And, you know, well, this isn't really working. And a little voice in your head will go, you know, you're right, that's not a great story, but I'm a really great story. I'm a really shiny new idea. I'm much better than the old idea. So why don't you stick the old idea in a drawer, your half-finished song, your half a poem, your half a short story, and start me instead. And you think, okay, that's what I'll do, because obviously that was a bad idea. About 10 pages into the idea that you're on, a little voice in your head will go, well, this isn't such a very good idea. Because we always doubt the things we're doing. You'll always doubt the value of it. And it's much easier to start something than it is to finish it. It really, really is. Finishing things is hard. And so that's one of the things writers, artists, car mechanics, anybody has to learn to do. Once you begin a job, you have to commit to finishing it. A science fiction writer named Ray Bradbury once said that professionals are amateurs who finish things. That's the difference. So, but it's very hard to do because you will doubt the value of what you're doing. You will want to throw it away. And all I can say to you is that it's natural. I'm now about to publish my 33rd book. Every one of those books I've wanted to throw it away after about 20,000 words. Every single one of them. It's just part of the process.
Excellent. I think that there's so much wisdom that came from you and added with Ray Bradbury thrown in there. Thank you so much for letting us know about that. I wanted to ask you, John, now that the book is in its 10th year, it's been reissued, and you've said yourself that you've had a lot of time to write in these past few months, in this past year. Do you feel like you might attempt to write another children's book or a middle grade novel or a young adult novel at some point?
I have written other young adult novels. I've always been very interested in science fiction, and particularly science fiction for young women, because women have often been excluded from science fiction. It's often perceived as quite male. And yet there are some fantastic female science fiction writers, but I wanted to write a series of science fiction novels that would appeal to, particularly to young women. And I wrote those with my Jenny, my better half, which was quite difficult because writers generally don't like collaborating with other writers. And you have to be very careful about arguing with somebody who can put glass in your food, okay? So I learned a lot of diplomacy doing that. And then some of my favorite, but I mean, all the books I've written, I hope they were the best thing I could do at the time. But I wrote 3 novels called the Samuel Johnson trilogy, which were about a small boy who discovers that his neighbors are trying to open the gates of hell. And only he and his dog can stop them. And I like those books because they're probably closest to my own speaking voice. And they, you know, when I write crime novels, I don't get to be funny. What I wanted to do with those books was to make somebody laugh on every page. And if you didn't get a joke on one page, don't worry, there's another joke coming along on the next page. You might like that one better. So I've always tried to write for younger readers, in part because it gives me an excuse to go out and meet them. And some of the best events I've had and some of the best times I've had have been talking to young readers in schools or in bookstores. Just because they respond completely differently to adults. They either love something or they hate it. When an event in a school or a bookstore with younger readers goes well, it's the best thing you can do. When it goes badly, you just want to die. You want to crawl off and hide under a table, because younger readers can be entirely merciless. You know, either you've done a good job or you haven't done a good job. And if you haven't done a good job, they will tell you about it.
I can totally understand where you're coming from. All right, John, we have 3 minutes left to wrap up. And now I'm going to ask you a question that we ask all our authors. It's one of our favorite questions. And this also comes along with Tasmia Pasha's question. So it's a two-part question. Tasmia asks, what type of books do you like to read? And we're asking you, if you could think about the books that have helped make you who you are, and if you had a shelf of these books, what would be on the shelf?
Very, very good question. The first books I ever read alone, you know, without an adult to help me, were Enid Blyton's famous 5 books. And I read them because I had really just started learning to read in school, and I was somebody who instantly took to reading. Because some of the words were quite long, I had to break them down. So there is a word in English, cupboard, cupboard. See, I know we don't use that in Ireland. We say press. I had never heard anybody use this word, and so I thought it was cupboard. And so I would go around for years going, Mummy, shall I get you something from the cupboard? And I think my mother thought she was living with little Lord Fauntleroy, you know. But I remember, and somebody, again at an event for young people, a young reader pointed out that the first book I'd ever read by myself was a crime novel, because the famous 5 is a crime novel. And so that was the book that set me on the path to being the writer that I am, I suppose. I loved ghost stories as a child and still do. So there was an English writer called M.R. James who wrote at the start of the 20th century, and it still wrote up what I think are the best ghost stories ever written. Really scary, because usually in a ghost story, the ghost it's something, you know, transparent that passes through a wall, and you think, oh look, there's a ghost. In James's stories, the ghost can feel you. They can touch you, and if you reach out, you can touch them, and they're kind of squishy and nasty, and that always stuck with me. So that was a very, very important part of my reading, ghost stories and those early crime stories. And now they would be writers like people who make me laugh. P.G. Wodehouse, I still love. I read recently, I used to love, I don't know whether you ever got The Magic Roundabout in India, which was a lovely children's TV series as a child. Emma Thompson, her father did the dialogue for them and wrote a series of stories about the Magic Roundabout. And I'd read them as a child, and I read them again about 4 years ago, and they still made me laugh. You know, that's what I love. Stuff that's funny should be funny for adults and children. It shouldn't be looking over the heads of younger readers at older readers and winking at them. The best stuff is funny for everybody, and funny in very, very similar ways.
Thank you so much, John. I think this has been an excellent session for all of us.
Well, they were lovely questions, so thank you very much.
Thank you. I think that we've taken away a lot from it. We're really hoping that we can meet you at some point when the world allows all of us to travel.
No, that would be lovely.
Thank you so much for taking the time out to do this with us.
A real pleasure. Take care of yourselves.
Absolutely.
Much love.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. See you. We hope that you enjoyed the session as much as we did. Thank you so much for being here today. We are really looking forward to seeing you at our next session, which is an interaction with the author Jane D'Souza on her book Flyaway Boy. If you haven't read it yet, do read it. It's absolutely compelling and very nice to read, and lots of imaginative work that's in there. We're really looking forward to speaking with her on the book, and we hope that we can see you then as well. Until then, stay safe, take care, happy reading. See you.